And although Russ and I will talk for about 30 minutes or so, if I'm looking at you to see that you nod and say, yes, this is the plan. And then we'll just open it up to conversation for another 30 minutes or so. Is that all? That's
After my introduction, the floor is yours, and you can do with this whatever you want. And I
okay.
think everybody will be engaged by that. So I will invite you
All right.
to say what you want to, and then run Q&A, and that'll
Okay.
be perfect. So again, for those of you
Terrific.
just joining us, I'm going to encourage you to go up into the right-hand corner of your Zoom screen where it says View, and go into Speaker View if you want to see the speakers close up. However, if you want to stay in gallery view and see all of your classmates and engage in the intimacy, that's fine too. So I'm going to go ahead and start and say hello, 79 Nation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Otho Kerr, and I want to welcome you to another 79 online session. If you hadn't heard, this is a year when the college did not give out any Class of the Year honors. And nonetheless, we received special recognition this year for our 79 Online Conversation on Race series. And we're continuing 79 Online with an event we had planned for our 40th reunion this past June, which parenthetically has not been rescheduled for 2021. So stay tuned. But we continue 79 Online with this event that is being called What the Founders Gave Us, featuring Peter Robinson and Professor Russell Muirhead. Our original idea was to have for the reunion was to have a nonpartisan discussion about American democracy, seeing how we might be able to talk across political lines of difference during a presidential election year. And today's conversation obviously couldn't be better well timed. I want to acknowledge that Adam Samuels, our current class president, new class president, is responsible for planning today's event, but he went into surgery yesterday for an emergency appendectomy operation. We wish Adam well. We're recording this for Adam and for others who couldn't join us tonight. So let me introduce our guest to you. Peter Robinson is currently the Murdoch Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he writes about business and politics, edits Hoover's quarterly journal, the Hoover Digest, and hosts Hoover's video series program, Uncommon Knowledge. He has degrees from Dartmouth, Oxford, and Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's written 3 books, including How Ronald Reagan Changed My Life. He served in the White House, where he was chief speechwriter for Vice President George Bush, and then special assistant and speechwriter to President Ronald Reagan. And you all probably know this, but he wrote the historic Berlin Wall address in which Reagan instructed Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Peter served on the board of trustees at Dartmouth.
Places along the coast, New Orleans, Florida, and so forth.
Hey, it's something you want to go on mute. That's perfect, thanks. And Peter currently lives in Northern California with his wife, their children, and their dog, Crusoe. Professor Muirhead, Russell Muirhead, teaches in the government department, where he focuses on American political thought. He's written on the moral meaning of work in American democracy, on parties and partisanship, and on conspiratorial thinking in politics. He lives in Hanover with his wife, Tony, and 12-year-old twins. Russ, I don't know if I told you this, but I'm an identical twin. So I know what you've had to go through, considering what I put my parents through as a twin. A couple of weeks ago, Russ was elected to the New Hampshire State Legislature as a representative from Hanover and Lyme. So, gentlemen, I'm going to go on mute. The floor is yours. Thank you for joining us. This class of 79 is deeply grateful, and take it away.
Russ, first, we'll come to your great passion, the Constitution of the United States, in a moment. But first, I want to ask the first things first. You stepped down as chairman of the government department at Dartmouth College in order to run for, and you have now become, congratulations, I suppose, one of the 400 members of the New Hampshire lower house, for which you will be paid the staggering sum of $200 per session. What were you thinking?
Well, you overrate me. as usual, Peter. I, I didn't even get to step down as chair of the government department, although it is the single most unsatisfying thing I've ever done in my
They've
professional.
talked you into remaining as chair? even
No,
though
I
you've been
just
elected?
I have to do it until next summer. The term doesn't run out, and there
Oh.
appears to be, you might be, saddened to know there appears to be no suitable replacement at the moment. So I'm still chair of the department. But I did kind of hope that by going into the legislature, among other reasons I had for it, I did sort of hope that it might cause the administration never to invite me to sit on any committee or do any administrative work again, because who wants a politician? And really, I don't think you can trust someone who's a politician. I mean, you really don't want a politician on one of these committees. So I'm hoping that I don't have to do any administrative work for as far as I can see. We'll see how that works out.
All right, so here's the story I will be telling friends. Russ is a political scientist. He's devoted his life to political theory, and he finally decided that he wanted to see it happen in practice. In the old-fashioned way, the New Hampshire legislature remains one of, I suppose, perhaps the only one where there are so many representatives, and New Hampshire remains a small enough state that each representative represents, I think it's about 3,500 people. So you represent portions of Hanover and Lyme, and it can be truly said of Russ Muirhead in 2020 that it remains true of what was true of New England democracy for the first decades, that you will be representing your neighbors.
Donated tablets and smartphones in parts of the country where there's a shortage.
I think could we ask someone to mute himself, herself?
With Wi-Fi access.
I'll see who that is and mute them.
Otho, I'll let you, there we go. Okay. So Russ, that's the romanticized version of why you ran for the New Hampshire's lower house. Is that true?
That's actually, that strikes me as about right, actually. Yeah. And it's because they bundle the legislature. We're in multi-member districts. Probably it's 10 or 15,000 people.
Oh, I see. All right.
So the district is a little bit larger, but they are, they ought to be. It's an amateur legislature, and it ought to be a legislature that isn't terribly partisan or ideological. Unfortunately, that's not the way it's shaping up. I mean, that's just not the way it's been in recent years.
Right.
And
Sure.
and it's surprising. It really surprised me how much outside money there is in these, paltry races, and how many organized groups tried to pressure candidates and pull them over to a particular, set of positions. So, it's really ought to be a very, a legislature full of kind of good practical judgment by people who come from all sorts of different walks of life. And instead, it's looking a lot like all other legislatures these days.
Okay. Well, speaking of your career, and I still have one child at Dartmouth College, I love this idea that we say at Dartmouth we want our faculty to be good at teaching and research. Baby, you're right out there in the front lines of the research. You are representing your neighbors. I like this.
Yeah,
okay.
right.
The Constitution. This brings us to the Constitution, Russ. And I would like to begin with a question that you put to students in your classes. And it strikes me as a beautiful question and actually a very difficult question. And the question runs as follows. You begin with a quotation from Thomas Jefferson. There's a famous Jefferson-Adams correspondence. Thomas Jefferson writes to John Adams, "No society can make a perpetual constitution. The earth belongs to the living. Every constitution should expire at the end of 19 years. By the way, it's clear from the context of the letter that 19 years is what both men were taking as a generation, a human life, generation. And so there's something there. Why should we agree to be bound by a document that's 230 some years old?
Yeah. And it's really Jefferson. He just couldn't wrap his mind around that. And it was Jefferson who calculated that every 19.7 years, the majority that exists at time A, time 0, has passed from the scene. So if we had a constitutional convention today and we ratified it today, the majority that exists in 2020 wouldn't exist in 2039 and a half. It would just have died and such. Enough people would have died. that they wouldn't be there anymore. So at that point, this dead majority is ruling the living, and to be ruled by some other group is a violation of the fundamental principle of democracy, government by consent. So you know, Jefferson really thought there should be a constitutional convention about every 2 decades. And he, you know, typically of Jefferson, he just worked himself into that thought, but he also really believed that human beings could be so rational as to, you know, design probably like, you know, he thought about constitutions the way I think about cars. And yeah, I do run my cars for a long time. I really keep them on the road for a hell of a long time. And I like to work on old cars, but 17, 18 years and the thing is just toast. And I've never really gotten 20 years out of it. So and then when you get a new one, you think, wow, these have really gotten a lot better. People get a lot better at making cars every 15, 20 years, and you shouldn't drive one for much longer than that. And that's the way he thought about constitutions. And Madison, of course, thought he was barking mad. And for one thing, the rock bottom reason was that Madison didn't think people were rational enough to agree to a constitution. And he thought they were rational enough in that one moment because the Constitution was wrapped up in the revolutionary project and in the very idea about whether the experiment that could prove to the world whether democracy could really happen. But in future years and future generations, he didn't think people would be able to really think in a sober and dispassionate and public spirited way. And I think Madison also understood that the point of the Constitution was
you're saying Madison. Do you mean Adams, or are you sorry?
No, I mean Madison here.
You do mean Madison. Oh, yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
The back and forth is really between Jefferson and Madison, and they're both good buddies. As you know, they're good buddies. They start a party together to unseat Washington. You know, they're really tight. They're both Virginian plantation. You know, and and so and they're writing letters to each other. And that might have been my own mistype in the exam. I do purvey, you know, I do disseminate a surprising amount of misinformation for professors. So I might have just thought Adams when I meant Madison. But anyway, Madison was the one who just really he was very polite about it. He's like, oh my gosh, Tommy, you're barking here. This is crazy. And Madison well understood that the point of the Constitution was in a profound way, the point of it is to frustrate people. And so there are these kind of dual tendencies to the Constitution. On one hand, our Constitution whispers something in our ears that is very, very alluring. It you know, gets our attention and it's attractive. And listen, I'll say to you all, because you're old enough, but I wouldn't say this to my students. You know, what it whispers is actually really sexy. And it arouses the desires, and it whispers, you know, you can rule. And that idea, just the word rule, you know, has a sort of a rousing feature to it. It's you know, it's power, it's control. It's you know, and I remember when I taught my kids, my twins, when they're you know, little tykes, what the word rule meant. As a political scientist, I taught it to them very early in life, and as soon as I taught it to them, they put a sign up on their bedroom door. I don't know if they're even 3 yet now. Allie and Lila rule this room, and they got it. They absolutely understood the power and the attraction of it. And the first 3 words of the Constitution whisper that in our ear: we, the people. Those are the most beautiful words in the Constitution, and you know. And the whole thing is about empowering we, the people. But when you know, we, the people, can rule because of this Constitution. That's why we love it. That's what it whispers in our ears. But at the same time that it seduces us into believing that we can rule, it frustrates us in about 6 different ways. And it makes it very, very hard for the people to rule. It frustrates us because it establishes representation in large districts. Madison did that on purpose. He wanted members of Congress, not like members of the New Hampshire House, to represent very large districts. In this case now, it's about 600,000 people per district. And the reason he wanted that, because he did not want a majority to discover itself as a majority. He wanted the district to be so big that if you shared an interest with other people in your district, you'd never know it. And if you did kind of figure it out, the district would still be too big for you to do anything about it. And so the majority could never form, and the majority could never speak. And he wanted to incapacitate the majority so that representatives, the second frustrating feature, could make up their own minds. He wanted representatives who were, his words were, diffused and established characters, better than ordinary citizens. And he wanted them to, quote, refine and enlarge public views. He didn't want them to mirror public views. And he didn't want them to cater to public views or to pander to public views. He didn't really even want them to know public views in any detailed way. He wanted them to know the people, but not the, and bicameralism, a House and a Senate. Nebraska doesn't have that. The other 49 states do have that. And means it's very hard to translate popular opinion into the authoritative power of law because, there's this second house that has to agree to everything. And that's in there, on purpose. The Senate's there to make it very hard for the people to rule. And not only that, a third of the Senate's reelected every 2 years, not the whole thing. I mean, it's not like the whole thing gets turned over every 6 years. So it takes a long time with this long 6-year term and staggered elections for the Senate to even reflect changes in public opinion. Separation of powers, everybody loves this stuff in civics when they learn checks and balances, the phrase that just like sucks the brain right out of your head because it stops you from thinking concretely. You're like, no, it was like, oh, checks and balances, that sounds so lovely. What those mean is you don't get to rule because you can't control this thing, the people. And a separation of powers, the president can veto all this stuff. And judicial review, if it gets through the House, the Senate, and the president gets the president's signature, the court might turn over the thing. So I mean, they're just right there. There's about a half dozen things that make it very, very hard for people to rule. They're going to be frustrated, and that's the whole point. That is the whole point of the Constitution, to make it hard for the people to do what they want. Now, there's a reason for that, but Madison knows that it's not gonna, it's gonna generate a lot of frustration and a lot of resentment, and he wants to make it pretty hard for people to change it.
Russ, you would agree with Antonin Scalia then? Antonin Scalia held that it was not the Bill of Rights that did the most in the Constitution to protect our freedoms, Bill of Rights, freedom to speech, assembly, religion, and so forth. It was the structure of the Constitution itself. It was setting the executive against the legislature and the legislature against the judiciary and the entire federal government against the states. You'd agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's Madison too. Your man, Scalia, got that from a better man, James Madison.
All right. I was wondering how you'd get Scalia off your back in answering that question. Okay, so let me quote you, Russ. This is from your introduction to Jeffrey Tulis. Is it Tullis or Tulis? The book.
I say Tulis. Yeah, Tulis.
Tulis, The Rhetorical Presidency, which is an important book. But I'm quoting you now. The Constitution teaches the ambitious that if they want to rule, they need to do difficult things, to assemble a very large, necessarily diverse, spatially dispersed, and long-lasting group. That is, get the House, control the Senate, get your people in the federal judiciary, capture the White House, and then hold that whole thing together for a good long time, which happens rarely in American politics. And it seems to me there may be a kind of corollary to that assertion on your part that the Constitution doesn't fit contemporary America all that well. And when I say contemporary America, I'm talking about the last couple of decades, when in Michael Barone's famous phrase, we've been a 49% nation, divided right down the middle. And we just saw it again on Tuesday, where it looks as though Republicans will pick up seats in the House, diminishing the Democratic majority. That chamber will be as closely divided as it has been in years. The Senate will be 51-49, who knows which way, perhaps. And the presidency has turned on 2 or 3 points in the popular vote, or to put it another way, about 150,000 votes across 4 states. Does the Constitution work when nobody can put together what you call a constitutional majority? Is it suited to times of deep division in the country?
Yeah, it's an open question whether there's really deep division or whether there's even division. Um, so, you know, there might be like a unimodal distribution of opinion and the two parties are just splitting it very, very expertly.
Finally, I see, I see.
You know, there could be a bimodal distribution of opinion, a big canyon between two large clusters, and that's a deeply divided nation. It looks like that. It sounds like that when you listen to members of Congress. They're bimodally distributed. They're deeply divided. I actually don't think ordinary Americans are deeply divided at all. I think that that's our, you know, political class. And I noticed just running for office, like I said, it's, you know, how these organized groups kind of try to pull you to the extreme. So if you want to get funding, if you need it, if you want to get, you know, what I had to do was win a primary election, and
Right.
that was the hardest part for me in the district I was in. And the hardest part about winning a primary election was getting my friends to vote in it. My friends are normal people. They don't vote in primary elections. It's really weird. I mean, like, how do you make a distinction between two people who agree on everything? And that's what you have to do in a primary election. And they can go to a general election. They know how to do that. That makes sense to them. But a primary is really weird. So I had to say, look, I'm running. There's an election September 8th. They're like, September 8th? And half of them came to me like, did the election happen yet? I said, no, it's September 8th, September 8th. So you know, you gotta get this group that knows there's a primary election to show up and vote. And those are not centrists, those primary votes.
So let me refine that question a little bit, if I may. So let's set aside the question of whether the Constitution fits a deeply divided country, and I'll go ahead and grant that the American people may continue to cluster toward the middle. But we know two things have happened in the last 20 years, well, 30 years or so, for sure. And one is that the parties have sorted themselves out on ideological lines. So in the old days, when I was working for Ronald Reagan in the White House, he, conservative Republican, could count on the support in the House of Representatives of between 30 and 60 conservative Democrats in the South. Those seats have been taken from the Democratic Party, now held by the Republican Party. Likewise, in the Senate, there used to be the old Northeastern liberal wing, Jacob Javits of New York, Ed Brooke of Massachusetts, Chuck Mathias of Maryland, Bill Percy of Illinois. He's not Northeastern, but still. And that wing has been wiped out. There's exactly one person remaining, and that's Susan Collins of Maine. And there used to be a dozen liberal Republicans in the Senate at any given time. The Republicans are now almost uniformly the Conservative Party, variations within that, but uniformly the Conservative Party, Democrats the Liberal Party. So you get that has become bipolar. And then with regard to the media, it used to be that every media used to be, and I'll put this in the period of decades. 3 decades ago, every media organization, New York Times, CBS, NBC, these are for-profit companies, and their incentives, their commercial incentive was to get the biggest audience they could. And again, that meant going for the middle. All those entities, New York Times, CBS, online entities, Fox News, they've fragmented. They're going after niche markets. I saw a poll the other day that showed 97% of New York Times subscribers identify themselves as Democrats. 93% of Fox News watchers identify themselves as Republican. That's an entirely new datum. So people are watching self-reinforcing media, and the media have an incentive, a straightforward commercial incentive to choose sides. That's new, at least in my lifetime. That's in our lifetime. I'm speaking of my classmates now. That's new. Does the Constitution work? That throws a wrench in the structure, doesn't it, or not?
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, listen, so this is the question. Can we make this Constitution work under these conditions? And I think you're right, Peter. I don't think it's just been 2 decades. I actually don't, at some level, I don't think the Constitution, it's not been easy to make it work for 50 years. I mean, there are roughly speaking 2 ways of making it work. The way that I described in that bit that you quoted, you create a constitutional majority, and that's, as you said, it's a majority in the House, 218 out of 435 House of Representative members. That's a numerous group, and it's a majority in the Senate. That's a geographically dispersed group. And it's a temporarily enduring group, because to hold a majority in the Senate, you have to stand together for at least 4 years, really for about 6 years. So numerous, dispersed, enduring. It's a large and lasting group. And if you can do that, you can also win the Electoral College. You can get 270 out of 538 electors. You can elect a president. Now that group can't really be stopped very easily. The court might stop it a little bit, but it's, you know, it's not going to be easy even for a court to stop a group, a large and lasting group that can control the House, the Senate, and the presidency for a long time. And what I've seen in my almost my whole life is that neither group of political entrepreneurs can make that happen. And yeah, so Reagan's in there. It's a new day. You know, you and your buddies and the conservatives, you know, like you get in there and all y'all did, you could, I just remember you whining and whining and whining about the incumbency advantage. The incumbency advantage that prevented you from winning the House of Representatives. How unfair the incumbency advantage was. And because there was this, like, you couldn't get the House. You got the Senate, you got the presidency, you couldn't get the House. And it stays that way until, and then finally, like, the first Democrat after Reagan to win, of course, Bill Clinton, the Democrats are back in the saddle. They're galloping, like they're galloping away full speed. They got the House, the Senate, the presidency, and they're going to pass healthcare, the thing they forgot about in 1948. And you know, we know what happened. 1994, the Republicans take the House, the thing that couldn't happen in the 80s, they do in 1994. They get the House, and there's divided government again, and it stays like that until George W. Bush is in, and he and Karl Rove are like, you know what, we're going to make this thing work. We're going to build a durable, governing, compassionate conservative majority. And it was a great idea. I thought they'd probably succeed at it. They're going to move, you know, conservatism a little bit to the center, which is probably where Reagan actually positioned it. And they were going to, you know, they're going to really try to make it work, make the Constitution work from a right of center way. And, you know, look, they pissed that away in the sands of Iraq, and they lose their majority. And then Obama gets in 2008, 2 years. He keeps it together for 2 years. The Republicans come back. They're in total control in 2016, and it's gone in 2 years. And here we are now, 2020. Donald Trump lost an election that he didn't have to lose. If he had a tincture of self-discipline or dignity, maybe, I don't know. That's a counterfactual. It's like, imagine there's no gravity. But if he, you know, he lost, but everything else, as you just said, is exquisitely divided. And it's not just, and the two parties have kind of worked themselves to a stalemate. Can we make the Constitution work? Well, we don't have a large and lasting majority. Each side is aiming for just an ephemeral majority. They want to get that 2 years and then pass a bunch of extremist stuff. And they're not really, it's like our leaders aren't really trying to, they're not listening to what the Constitution is whispering in their ear. I guess now the Constitution is like yelling, you know, make me work, make me work. Build a large and lasting majority, and you get it. You get like the big office. You get the nice parking space. You get to run this place, and they can't do it. And the only other way to make it work is to compromise. You can't build a really great coalition and hold it together for a long period of time. Then you have to compromise, and that's the heart of politics. And their compromise is compromising. It compromises your integrity. It's frustrating. It's unpretty. It doesn't make sense. Compromise is the politics like the Farm Bill. And, you know, and who loves the Farm Bill? Although it's a beautiful piece of legislation. And we should probably be teaching about the Farm Bill to 8th graders, because we've like got a bunch of moral purists. And look, they're like populating our universities, and some, even Dartmouth, bunch of people who just won't compromise anything. It's like the Civil War every day of the week, and everybody's an abolitionist, and this is not this is not how you make a government work. It's not how you make politics with each other. It's not how you make this Constitution work. And you know, I do think in general for people, you know, we have politics because we're stuck with each other, not because we like each other. There are a whole lot of people in this country I'd probably rather not be with in a political community. Maybe about 70 million, maybe it's only 50 million, but a surprising number I'd really rather not share a political community with. But they're here and they're not going anywhere. And so the only, you know, I guess there are only two choices. We can make war with each other. We've done that. We've had a civil war. Or we can make politics with each other. And to make politics with each other is to, you know, make peace with each other, to compromise with each other, to settle. And I really, you know, I think we've just been let down by the leadership class in this country. It's not able to build a large and lasting coalition, and it's also unwilling to compromise. And right now, Peter, I'm a little bit despondent. I mean, I'm not seeing a spirit of compromise. I'm not hearing the spirit of compromise from Washington, D.C. And I actually, it's sad. It's sad. I don't think you need to be any less conservative to be compromising. I don't think you need to be any less liberal.
Right. Russ, let me ask you, before we go to general conversation, let me ask you one more big question and then a couple of small questions. Here's the big question. This is from an essay, the Saturday essay in just this past weekend's Wall Street Journal by Yaroslav Trofimov, who is the chief foreign correspondent for the Journal. And the essay that he wrote was headlined, "Can the West Still Lead?" Quote, "China's astonishing rise over the past 3 decades suggests that prosperity can come without freedom, a new paradigm that is inspiring autocrats around the world." Close quote. The Constitution is a specific document that comes from a specific moment in time, late 18th century, cultural construct. Democracy, trace it all the way back to Athens if you want to. Give it the broadest possible cultural and historical base from which to stand. It's still a distinctively Western construct. And the Constitution dates from a moment when the West is rising. Now Asia is rising. What do you make of it? Is democracy's day, is the Constitution's day past?
I know it's I think it's really the fact that monarchy has always been the way of the world, the way of the political world. It's has a much longer history than representative democracy. And even when the West was ascendant, it was basically monarchic. And it's more intuitive, I think, and it has all sorts of advantages. And look, what the founders tried to do was fold the advantages of monarchy into democracy. And so they created this very, very powerful presidency. And so I do hope that, this is a regime that can take different forms and take different shapes. We're investing a lot of hope in the presidency. And we've been doing that for really since probably Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt.
Franklin, right.
And at the expense of kind of legislative democracy. So yeah, I mean, I think we can go toe to toe with the autocratic regimes because we have a kind of elective autocrat that can do a whole lot without a legislature behind them. But it is, I think, 1990, I come of age, we all come of age, we look out in the world and we see communism, the only great, fundamental alternative to the formula of, democracy and the polity and markets and the economy. We see communism just fail and fall of its own inner, vacuity. And it looked like democracy was not just the best answer, but really the only answer. And right now, listen, I teach students from different places around the world, and they don't think democracy is the right answer. We just watched China a few months ago learn of an outbreak in one of its provinces and test 9 million people in like 3 days. So I think there are a lot of people around the world thinking, wow, some sort of autocratic rule actually just works better. And that's a real existential threat. While we're bickering, refusing to compromise, and unwilling to stand in a large coalition with each other, there are some autocrats around the world who are, not just staying in power, they're actually collecting people's sympathies and causing people to think that they're doing a better job.
Last question before we open it up. This is a Dartmouth College question. You grew up in New Hampshire, but then you went south, Cambridge, undergraduate, master's degree, doctoral degree. You were taught at the University of Texas. Austin is a warmer place than Hanover. It's a bigger, more research-oriented institution, and Dartmouth College poached you from UT. What year did you come to Dartmouth, Russ?
It's a little over a decade ago.
A little over a decade ago.
It was summer 29, yeah.
And it would be improper for you to comment on this, but I have reason to suppose that if we poached you from UT, other institutions have attempted to poach you from us. Why Dartmouth? For you.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to be in an institution where the faculty had a certain sense of vocation that did, as you just pointed out, um, that did attach real value to teaching. That does attach real value to teaching. I want to be around. I want to be around other teachers who take the vocation of teaching really seriously, and who talk about their students and talk about their classes, and don't, you know, don't refer to teaching as just a kind of waste of time, and don't disdain it. But I also want to be around faculty who are research active, and who are really invested in the research, in the papers they're publishing, and the books they're trying to write, and the ideas they're thinking about. And there actually aren't that many places where that ideal of the vocation is lived out, and in the community of people, not just, you know, they're individuals at Texas who have it, but I have to say, in those large universities, teaching is not, it's often not taken so seriously. Um, and there does seem to be, you know, there are institutions. I don't think Williams, the people at Williams, are taking research seriously anymore. Um, and so at Dartmouth, you know, it's not just that the institution in some formal way, or, you know, the president, who cares, you know, stands up for this. It's actually the culture in the faculty itself. It's the conversations I have with my colleagues that you know, make me take each of these things as practices, not just as things I have to do. You know, practices. I practice at them. I practice them every day, just like you might practice a backhand, and I, you know, and I try to get better at them.
Great, thank you. Otho, do you want to open, you want to handle the conversation now, the questions conversation?
Sure. You know what? Let me go into
Okay.
gallery view and see if I can see everybody better.
Do you do that for all of us, or do we select which view, each of us, which view?
You get to select for yourself,
Yeah,
Peter.
you get
All
to
right.
select for yourself.
It's a
I
democracy.
there I am. I'm happy
There,
to
okay.
lead Q&A, but I'd love to. I saw that Andy Heller and Andy Heller put something in the chat about the two-party system. Obviously, George Washington railed against, warned us against a two-party system in his farewell address. And I think there are probably a lot of folks who are wondering, what are your thoughts about if we could somehow fix the party system? Is there a fix there that would help us have a more workable constitution?
If you're going to have a legislature, you're going to have something like a party system. So as soon as you're in a legislature, you know, if you want to do something, you got to have a majority of legislators to vote with you, because bills passed by some sort of rule is usually a majority rule. If it's much more than that, you're just never going to pass anything. So in legislatures, they usually have a majority rule, and if a group comes together to pass something, the thing it passed is always at risk of just being overturned the next day. Someone will change their mind and flip, or there'll be a new legislature elected in the next session, and so the thing you pass, call it Obamacare, you know, gets overturned in the next legislative session. So if you pass something you think it's good, then the group that passes it has to care about staying together over time and say, hey, we passed Obamacare, we think that's good. You know, why? They go out to the voters and they say, elect people who like Obamacare, or in the next session it's going to get overturned. We think it's, we pass it because we think it's good. We still think it's good. If you think it's good, elect people who support it. Now, I call that group a party. If you don't want to call it a party, call it something else. But the alternative to that is that you're just not going to get anything done in politics. And if you get something done, you're not going to keep it done, because it's going to get reversed quickly. So actually, you know, what Washington did was he warned against the spirit of party, not parties. And I mean, he warned against a spirit of factionalism that would cause the country to, you know, people in the country to turn against each other, to learn how to hate each other, to separate from each other. And so I think what we need are parties and partisanship that, you know, can exist yet alongside a kind of civic friendship and respect. And I mean, I think what we need right now is we need to learn how to encounter each other respectfully, which is much different than agreeing. I don't think we need to agree, but to encounter each other respectfully. I went to an election party the other night, and the guy sitting next to me, I voted for, guess who? Biden. And and the guy sitting next to me voted for, well, I don't know who he voted for. He supported Trump. He was sympathetic to Trump. And we hung out, we celebrated the end of the election, and we had a nice conversation. And I have to say, there's not a lot of that going on in the country. There's not a lot of people who are able to listen to each other and talk to each other and disagree with each other and enjoy a glass of bourbon together. And still, you know, I think he and I are probably never going to agree about much. But you know, that's not the spirit of party. You know, that's just being citizens and supporting what you think is right, but not kind of descending into hatred.
Thank you. I'm going to ask folks to simply unmute and ask a question if they want to, or to raise a hand, and I'll point to you, although I can't see everybody on the screen, so I might just ask you to volunteer to speak up. I see Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Jim.
So going back to this, the question Andy asked about multiple parties, it's always struck me that, you know, the moderate Democrats are, you've got, I don't know, 50% of the country, 2/3 of the company is really kind of right down the middle. And the moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans have never gotten together. They're always desperately afraid of the extreme wings of their party. In this election, you had people who hated Trump, but weren't going to vote. They were afraid of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, so they weren't going to vote for that, but they hated Trump. And the same is true in reverse in other elections. And why is it, again, go back to the spirit of party as you're talking about, but why is it that the moderates on both sides don't get together and say, you know what, the fringes actually shouldn't control what's going on. We collectively in the middle should control what's going on. And yes, you have to get anything passed, you got to reach out to the liberal wing on one side or the conservative wing on the other side to get a majority to get something passed. But at least you're passing it based on kind of what most of the country seems to want. That may be naive, but you know, it just it seems like every Democrats are afraid of the extreme wing of the Republican Party, and Republicans are afraid of the extreme wing of the Democratic Party, regardless of where anyone else sits. You know,
Yeah, people are worried about getting primary.
Well, the swings from one administration to another, going extreme one way, extreme the other, and just flipping back and forth from one administration to the other because the extremes control the primaries.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the way we're nominating candidates has become pretty problematic. I mean, California's experimented with a sort of top two nomination system rather than party primaries, so it doesn't seem to really help, I think. But yeah, that's right. You're right. I mean, I'm really interested in that question too. Is there a kind of a latent majority of centrist Democrats, centrist Republicans that can't come together? Sometimes it can't come together because the speaker of the majority party follows a rule, which used to be called the Hastert rule. That this was, you know, Republican speaker of the United States House of Representatives said, I'm not going to bring anything to the floor that lacks majority support from the majority party. And what that did was it just moved the pivot point to about the 25th percentile, you know, pretty far over to the extreme. And so there are all these pieces of legislation that, you know, might have passed with like a majority of the minority party and a minority of the majority party, and those kinds of things can never hit the floor. And so, yeah, I think some, you know, this gets kind of into the weeds of institutions, but maybe there are some interesting reforms that we could experiment with. You know, people are really enamored with ranked choice voting these days, which is a way of kind of having voters express a preference for smaller parties, but still participate in a large coalition. So you can vote for the Green Party. If it doesn't get, you know, a sufficient number of votes, then your second choice vote ends up getting counted instead of your first choice vote. And there might be things like that by which voters can kind of signal what their really ideal points are. And I think I think this is the real great challenge for political leadership in the country right now. is to, make the Constitution work by activating not just the center, but a kind of sometimes coalition. Might be a one-party coalition, but a coalition.
Right. But if you go back to the coalition idea, in today's world with gerrymandering, the extremes exist. The extremes dominate Congress, right? Because you can't win the primary without being on one edge or the other. And maybe changing the allocation rules on how congressional districts are defined could solve that problem. But the moderate Republicans and the moderate Democrats that used to be in office, they've all gotten run out of office on both sides because they lose in the primaries.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And so now you can't even get the old middle. It was like, okay, we got to get some of each side to agree to get to whatever that we used to see. And I think we used to see in, at our age, we used to see in the 60s, 70s, going back to the 50s, we used to see in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s when Reagan had, Republican presidency, go back to Peter Robinson, Reagan had a Republican presidency with Democratic House and Congress. Things were getting done because that 2/3 in the middle was getting stuff done, and they don't exist anymore.
Well, let's see what happens. I mean, the Democrats are going to have an intramural argument, and the left faction, the Democratic Party, looks like it's been, like it was defeated in this election. Did not result in kind of blue wave. AOC is very much on the defensive. I don't know if you saw her interview in the New York Times yesterday. She literally said, "I think I might take my ball and go home. I might not stay involved in politics anymore." I think she knows that she was defeated in this election. And so we'll see. It could be that the Democratic and the centrist members of the Democratic Party were saying, you're killing us. You're literally just we're not winning because of the extreme of this party. Defund the police is not a strategy for Democratic victories. And on the Republican side, Donald Trump has brought to the Republican Party Howard Dean's foreign policy and Bernie Sanders' trade policy. And the Republicans seem perfectly happy to have those policies. I wouldn't have predicted that 10 years ago. But they are now, for high tariffs to protect wage earners who don't have college degrees, and they're against military interventions abroad. So I have to say, a Republican Party that blends positions from Howard Dean and Bernie Sanders is a Republican Party that's moving, I would say, to the center. If not to the left. And if you can, I don't think this, I think that kind of position could be pretty successful, especially if it's not affiliated with, racism. And so that, we could see a Republican Party that I think it has moved to. I think Trump ironically moved it to the center in certain ways that haven't been appreciated. So maybe both parties will be much more centrist over the next 2 years, which doesn't mean that they'll find it easy to govern together. They both think they can win the whole show. See, right now, both parties think that they can win Congress, Senate, and the presidency. When each party thinks that, it doesn't want to compromise on anything, because to compromise is to give a victory to the other side, give them something to campaign on just a few months away. So while each side thinks that it can win the whole thing, each side is extremely uncompromising, and that's right now the exercise, exerting this other kind of destructive force. Either one side has to do that, or they have to start figuring out how to compromise pretty soon.
Who else has a question out there?
Hey, can I send one to you? It's Peggy.
Go ahead. I'll let you ask it.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, you can ask questions unless you turn on your camera.
No, we've been in the car and you don't want that. Anyway, just quickly, I'm curious, both Peter and Russ, if you think there will be a peaceful transition of power. And are you as uncomfortable as I am watching Barr and Pompeo and McConnell stand by and reinforce Trump's outcry for, that this is a corrupt election? And what do you see happening in the next month? And do we have to worry about the Electoral College as well being pressured to
So,
not vote
Peggy,
states?
I'm going to just
Yes.
interject and say we're going to try to not make it political, but I will just ask for an observation about the transition of power.
Well, yeah, that was not trying to be political. That was just they were concerned. So yeah, okay, transition of power. Will it happen?
Yes. I mean, you want to jump on that, Peter? Or
No, you're the man. You're the man.
Okay,
I have
Well,
views, but
yeah.
I'm an old Reagan writer. Everybody knows what my views are. Go ahead, you.
I mean, I will say this, there's this, the core of democracy is the willingness. There's just two things that at a fundamental level you need to make democracy work, in a very elemental, minimal way. When office holders lose elections, they need to walk away, as Peggy just said, peacefully. And when people win elections, they need to refrain from using the powers of the office to persecute and prosecute their opponents. And those two practices are what sustain this idea of a legitimate opposition. The legitimate opposition doesn't mean that you think the opposition is legitimate because its views are somehow legitimate. You can think the opposition is catastrophic and they don't have a legitimate position in their entire portfolio. But you do have to be willing, you do have to think that they have a claim to rule when they follow the rules of the game that apply to both sides in cycle after cycle. And the first time that happens in human history is when Tommy Jefferson, whom you mentioned earlier, Peter, having machinated with his buddy James Madison to defeat the poor guy, the guy we did have there, John Adams, poor John. One-termer, Federalist John Adams, loses to Jefferson on the 36th ballot, I think, in the House of Representatives. John Adams is pissed. I mean, he was always kind of pissed. He's a sort of bilious guy, not an easy guy to hang with. But he's extra pissed, and he's just walked away. He said, take it, here are the keys, I'm out of here. And he went back to Quincy. And that was an extraordinary thing to do. Of course, he was kind of following this even more extraordinary example of George Washington, who refused to stay after a second term when he knew he could have stayed for the rest of his life. And that doesn't happen again in the United States until, oh my gosh, like 3 decades later, when his son, Johnny's son, John Quincy, is in the presidency again, loses to Andrew Jackson after one term. And he's not quite as pissed, but he does walk away and he runs for Congress and comes back and he makes his mark. But he walks away after one term, just like his father. And you could say that those people who do that, I mean, gosh, like George Herbert Walker Bush did more to sustain the United States Constitution than probably any president in my lifetime by upholding that practice after one term. Imagine how bitter he felt in 1992. And so, yeah, I think I gave a talk last year at Pomona, and of course students, a lot of students are educated to think that everything's wrong about American democracy and with the American Constitution, and all of our social practices betray everything that we believe in, which is, kind of true, I suppose. And we have high ideals, and it's really hard to live up to them. And in many cases, we don't try. And I was talking about this idea of a legitimate opposition, how important it is to democracy. And Peggy, I've been worried about it for a few years now. And I had the students say, well, you're talking about democracy like it's a good thing. You're talking about and he started talking about Chomsky and manufactured consent, like I had never heard this stuff before. And I just said, listen, okay, I know, I hear you. Okay, so you have a really radical ideal of democracy. You don't think that the actual practice of democracy is much safer. I just want to ask you one thing. If a president were to lose an election and refuse to leave after one term, would you call that bad? And the student said to me, he said, I think somebody from my privileged position should answer that question. I was like, somebody from your privileged position has an obligation to answer that question, exactly that question. And I think there is, I don't think people fully appreciate just how fragile that idea of legitimate opposition is, and just how hard it is on the people involved to uphold it, just how hard it was for George Herbert Walker Bush to walk away with the grace and the dignity and self-restraint that he exhibited on that day at noon when he walked away from the White House, and every day after that he exhibited for the rest of his life. And I think that's the example that I'd like to see everybody hold in mind over the next 8 or 9 weeks.
Hey, Russ, Andrew, Peter, what would be the one or two things you would do as far as amendments to the Constitution to make it more durable?
You know, I tend to think that one of the ways you make the Constitution work is to breathe, take that Jeffersonian spirit that Peter mentioned earlier, that idea that every generation should rewrite it. That's crazy, but I mean, that's dangerous, and but there's something to it. And I think there is a way in which not every age needs to make it its own. And the progressives, they made it its own. They adopted the direct election of senators instead of state legislatures electing senators. They created these political primaries that are not working very well. Other things, the referenda, I'm sure, all of you in California think that's a great thing too. But it's not so much that they did great things, but they made it their own and they reformed it. And it was from the, all those experiments culminating in suffrage for women. In the Great Amendment that gives women the vote in 1920. So they renovated the Constitution, and I do think that the students, the generation of our students today, the students at Dartmouth, this generation, they need to make this Constitution theirs. They're going to need to amend it. They're going to need to recraft it, to hold to its, keep it, to preserve its soul by taking the body to the gym, giving a little bit of a workout. And I don't know, I mean, I think we're gonna need something about campaign finance. We're gonna need something maybe about, some new rules about nominations. We're gonna need something that looks less partisan and that privileges independence a little bit. And I think we need to really put our heads into this kind of spirit of experimentation, so that the younger people a generation younger than me can really look at it and regard it not just as this venerable inheritance, but also as theirs.
Yeah, and Peter, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how you might amend the Constitution. But there was a question put in the chat. What are your thoughts about term limits?
You want? I'm just a member of the class of '79 here. Russ is our expert.
I think both of your perspectives are terrific.
Well, thank you, Othal.
I
Did
mean,
you hear that, everybody?
I think there's a legitimacy crisis in the Supreme Court. It's really not an institution that's designed to withstand intense popular pressure. I think Justice Roberts is really thinking about the court from an institutional way and not just thinking about it as somebody who, I mean, he may have disappointed you in certain ways, Peter, but he's really thinking about how to make this thing last. And it could be that 10-year terms are a way to allow us to fight over it without experiencing quite as much frustration. 10-year non-renewable terms or something like that.
Your thoughts, Peter?
Well, my little speech would be, I'm a little more sanguine than Russ about the Constitution and about the whole democratic experiment. And I'll tell you why. I mean, I could go on and I won't do that, but I'll just give you one little sliver of why. For a Republican like me, for somebody who came of age during the 80s, came of political age during the 80s, the secret fear of Republicans, what we'll only talk about when we're together, but because you're my classmates, I'm opening my soul to you. The secret fear of Republicans is that the book by Rudy Teixeira, that must be a decade old now, The Emerging or the Coming Democratic Majority. And the premise of that book was really simple. The Republican Party is Plymouth Rock, and the Democratic Party is Ellis Island and every immigrant group after. And the secret fear of Republicans is that although we believe that we're based in certain principles about individual liberty and free markets and so forth, although Republicans believe that they place great emphasis on the founding of the party in 1856 as an abolitionist party, that it's infused with ideals and idealism. The secret fear is that really what it was a white person's party. And here in California, in spite of all kinds of obstacles, Russ mentioned the jungle primary system that got adopted here in California about a decade ago, which has made it much harder. I'm sure Russ will be aware of political scientists who've written about this. I haven't written detailed studies, but as best I can tell, it makes it harder for the Republican Party to field candidates. Set that aside. The races are very, very close right now. And I don't think they've been declared yet, but of the couple of seats that the Republican Party will pick up, House seats that the Republican Party will pick up here in California, one, I think she was declared a winner, a woman called Michelle Park Steele, who is the daughter of Korean immigrants. Another woman who's very close and in the lead with 90-some% of the vote counted, whose name escapes me, I'm sorry to say, but also Korean immigrants. And then in a heavily Democratic district, squeaker of an election, but he's in the lead now by a few hundred votes, a guy called Mike Garcia, whose parents are Mexican. And if you look at the really interesting Republicans here in California, this is not an office holder, but she will be sooner or later. I think there's a woman called Harmeet Dillon up the road from me in San Francisco, Indian. The impressive Republicans in the California legislature, Indian, Pakistani, Vietnamese. Someday in the next 10 years, 15 at the very outside, the Republican nominee for governor of California is going to be the child of immigrants from Vietnam or India, Mexico, possibly an African American. I say possibly because the population here in California is smaller than in the rest of the nation. And that will change everything. So that is very heartening to me. In some basic way, the back and forth between the parties, the idea that any one party, and in this case, it was quite explicit that the Democratic Party would essentially have a lock on recent immigrants to this country, it just doesn't turn out to be true. There's constant sorting out, resorting out, reassertion of principle in various ways. And I have to say, and by the way, I'm not talking about a massive Republican victory here. Of the 53 House seats that California represents, if things go well in the 2 or 3 races that are still undecided, well, from my point of view, Republicans will have 8 of the seats. This is not a Republican wave, but it's just a little glimmer that shows, you know what, this thing, this Democratic thing still really is alive. It's still kicking, it still works. That's my little speech.
We're at 35 minutes past the hour. Should we take one more question? Josh? Well, I see Josh and Dave, so why don't we take 2 more questions in that order, and we'll leave it at that.
All right. Thanks, Otho. Thank you both. It's been really interesting. Peter, you said earlier, you held up earlier when talking about the media, the way I interpreted what you said, at least, you held up sort of the New York Times as the Democratic mirror image of Fox. You referred also to NBC and CBS, and gave the statistic that 95% of New York Times readers are Democrats, and 94, I think, if I recall correctly, Fox viewers are Republican. I'm going to bring my interpretation to this and going to invite you to tell me why I'm wrong. The way I look at it is the New York Times is not partisan. The New York Times has Michelle Goldberg and has Russell Muirhead, right? So the New York Times tries to present, in my view, the facts, right? there are partisan views that come in on the op-ed page on both sides, and they got in a lot of trouble for that a couple months ago for having the other side, so to speak, have a prominent op-ed. Fox, it maybe not the news, but the talking heads, to my mind, are very partisan. And I'm just wondering what I'm missing in your mind, or is there more of a difference as I'm trying to present?
No, what first, the point I was making was drawn from a poll, some poll or other. I'd take the time to Google for it, but we don't have time for that. Some poll or other, some polling operation or other simply polled people who were subscribers to the New York Times, regular viewers of Fox News, and there must have been a dozen different media entities. And these people themselves identified as, in the case of the New York Times, some very high level Democrats, and in the case of Fox News, some very high level Republicans. So the New York Times has Ross Douthat, who's conservative, and Fox News has Juan Williams and Donna Brazile on their panel of commentators, and Juan Williams and Donna Brazile are both Democrats. They both have, I don't want to say tokens because it's more than that. Ross Douthat is a very serious writer, but they both have representatives of a range of views. My point is simply that modern media companies are now serving niche marketplaces. For example, I don't know that I can prove this because I don't know that such polls were done. But if you went back 30 years, I think the New York Times would have been probably substantially heavily Democratic readership because New York was such a heavily Democratic town, but it would have had more Republicans, I think. Certainly CBS, NBC, these major operations, for reasons of pursuing profit, drove themselves into the middle, seeking the largest possible audience. Now, in my judgment, my experience, they're seeking niche audiences as a matter of business practice. That's all. That's my only point. Now, you may think I'm mistaken about Fox or the New York Times, or you may think the whole thesis is mistaken, but that's what I was arguing.
And in fact, to your point, Peter, Pew Research actually did a piece on that I just happened to read yesterday.
Oh, really?
Comparing those news units with others, but over the last 10, 20 years, actually describing what you just articulated. David.
Yeah, I had probably a similar question, but it is about the media and about someone else had posted Citizens United. But for both Russell and Peter, I'd be interested in your views on, I'm actually less sanguine than you are, Peter, about the media from the perspective. I completely agree with the thesis of the business pressures, but I think the ability to target more or increasingly niche markets is just getting easier and easier and more prevalent. So more and more people are not getting their news from the New York Times or the Washington Post or Fox News or CBS. They're getting it from other channels. Those channels are easy to set up, cheap to set up, and each and every one of them creates kind of their own echo chamber of, gee, I've logged on, I've seen 5,000 people that share my point of view. And then you add on top of that Citizens United and people throwing money at campaigns and Russell describing his challenge of actually winning a primary. All of those things seem to me to be likely to get worse, not better. All of those pressures of the money in politics, the fragmentation, the pushing towards the edges of the primaries. You both described a lot of things in ways that I might be able to view optimistically, but I worry about those pressures leading to a greater degree of fragmentation even than we've seen. And I'll make one side comment, and this is not meant to be political, but I actually think the whole discussion about whether we'll have a smooth transition of power is a reflection of that. And maybe this is, Russell, because I wasn't around with John Quincy Adams, though I do live in Plymouth. I I cannot imagine, and I believe my kids could not imagine, that we would have a president who would not leave office. That just, to me, is just unfathomable. And that's, I'm not going to make a comment about the individual will be leaving, but I actually think that's a news story because it's actually a profitable story for news outlets to run with. And I don't think that's an isolated thing. I think there are a lot of news stories, and I should have added one other part to the news story, and I'm sorry for dragging on this. I actually think part of what causes this problem is the pressure to be fast and first with a news item to attract viewers. If you're the first one out with a news story, everybody's going to come back to see what you thought about this. So I personally have no concerns that he will leave office. I think if he chooses not to, he'll be find himself standing alone in the freezing cold on the porch on January 20th. But I am concerned that all of those pressures that lead to more fragmented points of view are just going to make things worse. Anyway,
Listening to you,
can I be
David,
real?
makes
I'm
me
sorry, go ahead,
think.
Russ.
I'm sorry, Peter. What I was thinking, Peter, is that what we really need to do is buy a copy of my book for everybody in your class. I mean, it won't cost the class that much. And I keep worrying that the book's going to be obsolete. I thought as soon as we published it, it's called, a lot of people are saying, The New Conspiracism, the Assault on Democracy. It's about conspiratorial thinking in American politics. And when I finished the book, I wrote it with a friend of mine, Nancy Rosenblum. And when we sent it out, we thought, what if this all goes away, by the time the book comes out? I thought, well, okay, it won't be good for the book.
Right.
And
the book has legs.
yeah, I know it's done well. So, and now I still think, well, maybe buy it now. Maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll be obsolete in 3 months. You will have wasted $12. But maybe it'll be more relevant than ever. And
Are you going to start your own cable news channel now? The way this is going, the way you're flagging books,
it's not the only thing.
There's a small step between you and Bill O'Reilly.
I have some nutritional supplements that I think will also work well for the class.
I've got some toe fungus that's a problem. Do you have a treatment for that?
Oh boy, do I. I think that I think we're in a bit of a Gutenberg moment. The movable type motivates people to translate the Bible, which had been written down in whatever Greek on vellum, into vernacular languages. A few people get killed over doing that, but eventually it gets written and translated and published, and ordinary people don't have to rely on their priests to tell them what God wanted them to do. And that sets in motion, just a series of schisms that overturns a millennia of Roman rule in Europe. And it took centuries to re-equilibrate. I think it caused not just wars of religion, but maybe even a democratic revolution. And whereas just a few years ago, it cost a significant amount of money to communicate with 40, 50, 100 people. And now, having just sent a mailer, by the way, to everybody in my district, Peter, that's how I know how many people I represent. It cost me a small fortune. But you can communicate with 7 billion people on Twitter for free if your tweet goes viral, and anybody can say anything to the whole world for free. And this has displaced the gatekeepers, the producers. You think Fox News is the problem? The producers at Fox News are not deciding what people learn about, and the editors at the New York Times are not deciding, because it's up on YouTube, it's up on Twitter, and it's up on Facebook, and those platforms don't know what to do. They don't know how to exert a gatekeeping function. The gatekeepers have been displaced, and so it's a new Gutenberg moment, and it's really roiling our politics. And I put it that way because it really goes way beyond each party is going to try to exploit the new technology for its benefit, but it goes way beyond parties and partisanship. We're in a new world, and we haven't figured out how to, I guess, curate information in a way that allows us to live in a shared world of facts and events, so that however much we disagree, Peter and I will disagree about politics, but we inhabit the same world of facts and events, so we can have conversations. Our common sense is intact in both cases, even though it doesn't always seem like it. Like mine is intact when I'm talking to him, but that's what makes it possible to disagree with each other, is that we inhabit that shared world. And this new media environment is, I think, really raising the question whether we can continue to inhabit a world and can continue to disagree.
And Peter, you wanted to say?
Oh, no. Well, for David, one hopeful note, I'll go all the way to the other side of the continent. And it's this: Joe Biden carried Maine, Democrat Joe Biden carried Maine by about 9 points. And Republican Susan Collins carried Maine by about the same margin. And what that means is there were tens of thousands of Downeasters who said, I'm going to vote for the Republican here and the Democrat here. And what that reflects is absorbing the news, independent thinking, the ability to think through the ballot and ticket split. So the basic premise of the founders, which is actually, if you construct a constitution that doesn't permit temporary majorities to sweep through and abuse the minorities, but there is a common sense, there is an ability to make political judgments and learn to live together. And yet again, those ornery voters in Maine showed us. That's so I just find hopeful notes on either end of the continent. And I also, if I may, Otho, thank you so much for organizing this. But I'd also like to say that Russ Muirhead, I don't know how, it's such a pleasure to see you all, by the way, but I thought our government department in our day was pretty spectacular. Vince Starzinger remains a hero of mine. And I think you'd agree after watching and listening this evening that Russ Muirhead is a worthy successor to the great figures that we were privileged to experience in our own
Zinger.
day. So thank
Yeah.
you, Russ.
Thank you, Peter.
On the other hand, the
Peter. Thank
real
you,
reason,
Russ.
the true reason he had trouble getting elected was that his neighbors know him so well. Thanks, Otho. I'm done.
Peter,
Over to you,
thank
baby.
you. Russ, I don't know if you have any good night comments. Imagine we're your twin children and they want some reassurance. Do you have any final thoughts before they go to bed that you can share with us?
You know, I do agree with Peter. I actually do share that sensibility, that hopeful sensibility that he, I think, voiced so with such characteristic eloquence. And I think that it's really hard to figure out what's going to happen tomorrow. Tomorrow always surprises us. And I think there are, it can be darkest right before the dawn. And there may be some things happening, as Peter was just pointing to, that might actually make our politics more healthy than it seems like it's going to be today.
Wonderful final thoughts. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Russ. Thank you, Adam. Hope you're feeling better. And good night, 79 Nation. We'll see you at the next 79 online event, whenever that is. Talk to you all soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Otho. Wonderful program. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Nice to
Professor.
see you
Thanks,
all.
Peter. Fantastic. Thank you.
Bye.